Yeah, Judges 13. So we are, what we're going to do is today we'll look at chapters 13 and 14. And then Sunday evening, we're going to conclude our study of Samson, looking at chapters 15 and 16. Because really his is a story you can't just not finish. The whole point is when you begin, you really have to make it to the end. So we'll look at our reading today, chapters 13 to 14, and then the rest Sunday evening, which means the great climax will come Sunday evening. You all know I like to point out where Christ is in the story, and we need a lot of Jesus in this story because it's an awful story, let's be honest. So I'm going to push that back to Sunday night. Okay, so it'll be just pretty straightforward this evening. So the essence of the story of Samson is that God uses weak people, no matter how strong they or others think that they are. That's the basic message of Samson. God uses weak people despite how they or other people think how strong they are. And Samson, of course, was a man of great weakness. We remember him for being an Arnold Schwarzenegger. And by the way, did you know Arnold Schwarzenegger got his start working in like a grocery store. And one time someone walked in and wanted to know where the cereal was. And he said, "I'll be back." But it's okay. It's okay. You didn't know where that was going. I know that's what I like about it. So Samson, though strong physically, is weak morally and spiritually, and so he loses his temper. He has a weak temper, a weak temperament. Right, the foxes. So I was telling Danny this, like, I don't remember that story about the foxes. I don't know. You'll read it tomorrow where he lights foxes' tails on fire. I didn't remember that. I used to watch cartoons about Samson when I was in children's church, and that was not in there. Rightly so, right? I'm okay if they left that part out. I mean, killing the lion was cool, but burning a city down with foxes is pretty wild. He's weak in his self-control. He's weak in his discernment. He's weak in his integrity. He's weak. However, the story of Samson begins here in chapter 13 with what we could call great expectations. And notice how it begins, verse 1. The people of Israel, again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. You could take that verse and say this is, in essence, the narrative of Judges. Over and over again, the people abandon their as being the people of God and the law of God, and so they go into judgment. So God disciplines them. They repent, and they are brought back. And so you have a period of being under judgment, a period of being ruled by the judges. And here judges essentially mean like governors. They would rule and have authority, but you don't have a monarchy. What you have, Israel, is basically a loose coalition of 12 tribes. This, of course, becomes an issue with Saul and David later on. Remember, David is crowned king of Judah before he's crowned king of Israel. That's because of their type of federalism, to use an American term. But this phrase is used throughout Judges. I'll give you a few examples. Judges 2, and the people of Israel did what was right in the sight, what was evil, rather, in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals. So, again, remember, eyes are very important. Remember, it was Eve saw that it looked good. So the eyes are going to play a major part, usually when it comes to evil and sin. And so from here, starting in chapter 3, many of the judges, their story is introduced with this language. So Othniel in chapter 3, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth, right? Of course, Elijah will come later, and what are they doing? They're doing what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. They're worshiping Baals and Ashtaroth, right? Ehud, lefty there, who with the sword, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They were strengthened, Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In case you didn't hear me the first time, there it is again. Deborah and Barak, for the record, that is not Barak. You have no idea. For 8 years, people would say, Barack Obama's in the Bible, right? Right? Like, yeah, and in the story, he's like a hero. Right? I mean, you're clearly not a fan of the dude, and that's fine, but he's not in the Bible. It's not even spelt the same in English. Come on, people. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after he had died. Gideon in chapter 6, people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. Of course, the Midianites, the ones that took Moses in. Gideon, rather. We did Gideon. Jephthah, people of Israel did was evil in the sight of the Lord. So Baal's Ashtaroth, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, gods of Moab, the gods of Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines, and they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. I mean, my goodness, that is Baskin-Robbins of idolatry. They tried all 23 flavors. I mean, they just put them all in there. And so chapter 13, verse 1, this is the last time this phrase is found in Judges, even though Samson is not the final judge. Now, he's the last judge of the book, because what you're going to get in the end is basically civil war. The last judge is considered also the first of the prophets, and that, of course, is Samuel. And he's described as such as a judge. But in the book of Judges, Samson is the last one. And no wonder, after Samson, you're thinking, maybe we should try something different, for once. But the book of Judges is basically a great libertarian experiment, right? So remember, there are two extremes when it comes to morality. One is legalism. That is, you follow the rules and all that. That's Pharisaism. Then there's the libertarian bent, which you get in the book of Judges. Here, everyone does right in their own eyes. And in fact, some of you have probably lived in the swing. Maybe you grew up in a more conservative, legalistic society. I told you all before, the elderly lady who smacked me on my behind when I walked in the sanctuary with a foam cup from the Boynton Pool Hall on a Wednesday night because it was raining outside. I didn't want to walk around, so I walked in the front door, and I was going to go right back to the fellowship hall area. And she said, "No drinks in the sanctuary." She just whacked me. I didn't tell Mom for years, and that was a wise thing. I didn't know it at the time because Mom would not have tolerated that. But so that was a very legalistic bent. Now we're very libertarian. We could just do whatever it is you want, and if you disagree with me, you're a bigot. And of course, one of the sources of the problems is that there is no ruler in the land. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what's right in his own eyes. Same thing in chapter 21, which is the end, which then bleeds into the story of Ruth. Now, it is possible the person who wrote Judges, it's an anonymous book, possibly wrote 1 Samuel. And one of the reasons we think that is because the story ends with the Benjaminite tribe. They're bad. And then 1 Samuel, the first king, is of the tribe of Benjamin. He's bad. Right? You see where this is going? And some see Judges as propaganda is too strong of a word, but it's setting the reader up for David, and there may be some truth to that, right? So, and next week we'll look at where they cry out for a king. So as we see, God has responded with discipline in verse 1, and in this instance it comes with the Philistines. These, of course. This oppression lasted for 40 years. I don't think that number is an accident. And it did not conclude until Samuel, the last of the judges, defeated the Philistines at Ebenezer. The tragedy of Samson is that Israel was under greater oppression following his life than they were when his life began. So he is a man of great strength and a high calling, but he ultimately failed in many ways. Now, the Philistines will continue to pester Israel for generations to come. There's a story in the Bible where the Philistines come out against the Israelites, and they have a giant named Goliath. I don't know if you've ever heard this story. Yeah. And so David has to come and fight the Philistines. And actually, the story, we'll see this here in a minute, the story of David fighting Goliath, there's some similarities with the story of Samson and his war against the Philistines. I found this interesting that the land of the Philistines eventually became known as Philistia. The Greek word is Palestine. And so when Caesar, the emperor Herodian, who built Herodian's wall up in Brittany, he called the land of Canaan Palestine. And it's a term we still use to this day. So the Philistine people aren't around, at least in the traditional sense. But that term certainly still is. But in verse 2, we're drawn back to the story of Abraham and Sarah, right? And it says, there was a certain man of Zorah and the tribe of the Danites whose name was Manoah. His wife was barren and had no children. So we are drawn right into the story of Abraham and Sarah. We have a couple here who are infertile. And what God is going to do is he is going to, through the miraculous birth of their child, liberate Israel. There is a divine appointment upon him. So we get this in the story of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah struggle with this. Hannah and her husband in 1 Samuel 1 and 2. John the Baptist's parents. Jesus' parents have, it's a miraculous birth. We are to see these connections. And what's fascinating about the Bible is that religion often sees barrenness as judgment. The Bible often sees it as opportunity. Because it's those who are suffering from barrenness that the Lord chooses to bless beyond others. And then in verse 3, we've really got to move on. Verse 3, the angel of the Lord appears. He appeared to the woman and said to her, behold, you are barren, have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb. He shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. So this is the third appearance, by the way, of the angel of the Lord in Judges. He first appeared in chapter 2. It's sort of an interesting appearance. Angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I swore to give you to your fathers. I said, I will never bring. So I want you to notice this. Who brought them out of Egypt? I thought it was God. He's taking the credit for himself. So whenever we talk about the identity of the angel of the Lord, I do think he is a pre-incarnate Jesus. And this is just one reason for seeing this. He shows up in the story of Gideon, and now here with the birth of Samson. And they are, in verses 45, to raise him as a Nazarite. Now, Nazarites' vows are usually temporary and voluntary. And Samson, his is to be his entire life. It's very possible John the Baptist had a lifelong Nazarite vow. He comes out with his hippie hair and his Duck Dynasty beard. And so, he wasn't wearing a suit. So I guess John the Southern Baptist, had a hard time getting in pulpits. But nevertheless, but Paul is perhaps the best example of a temporary Nazarite vow. Remember, he was accused of desecrating the temple by bringing the Gentile in. And so he takes, he shaves his head, and in shaving it, he will not cut it. And he takes these vows in order to dedicate himself for the Lord. And there's three things they were not to do. First, eat nothing or drink nothing that the grapevine produced. This is wine, okay? And fermented Welch's grape juice, of course. Secondly, he has to grow out his hair. He can't cut it. And thirdly, he cannot touch a dead body. Now, Samson violates all three of these. He's got 3 rules, right? Now, if mankind can keep one rule, don't eat of this fruit, you think one dude's going to keep 3 of them. He does violate them. Now, we're making an assumption with one of these. The first one is the wine. Judges 14:10. His father went down. This is where he's wanting to get married to the Philistine girl. And Samson prepared a feast there. These sort of wedding feasts would always include wine. And so the assumption is, being that he violated the other ones without any repentance or remorse, we should assume he's doing the same thing here. He certainly acts like he's under the influence. It's where he gives the riddle. He cuts his hair. Of course, Delilah, he tells Delilah the source of his strength is his hair. And finally, he does touch several carcasses. One example is when he slays the lion in chapter 14, as we'll see. He has slayed the lion, and then he comes back and gets the honey out of the lion. He will he'll travel almost 30 miles, 25, 30 miles to go get the clothes because, he got manipulated out of the riddle. And he has to slay all those guys. And he takes the clothes off of them, which requires touching dead bodies. He weaponized the jawbone of a donkey. Right? That donkey was not alive when he did that. Again, he violates this over and over and over again. And so in this context, I do think John the Baptist represents what Samson should have been. Because John the Baptist doesn't do any of this. So we are to see that Samson was physically strong, but he is ultimately spiritually weak. John the Baptist was, as far as we know, physically normal. But he was spiritually strong. He was mighty. And notice there, verse 5, God shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. That's interesting. I never noticed that before. It doesn't say God will deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines through Samson. He will begin that process, and that process will take generations. Yeah, Lonnie.
My hand it says he shall, and it is not capitalized.
Oh, really?
What did that understand the one then?
For the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel. Oh, yeah. That's going to be on the meaning of the antecedent. Either way, Samson will not finish the job. And so I want to do more skipping than what I have here. Samson's mother tells her husband, describes the angel of the Lord. She describes his appearance. In Hebrew, it says his appearance. Hebrew will do that, repeat the same word twice for emphasis. He's described as awesome. It's the same word for fear. For example, in Genesis 3, I heard the sound of you in the garden and I was afraid. It's the same word here, but it's translated awesome. But so to be in awe is something that is awesome. It is also something that can be awful. Something that is terrible is something that can be terrific, right? Those root words even show up in English. So something can be awesome, and yet it's something that stirs fear. Same thing in Genesis 15, fear not, right? Same word there. And so what happens is the angel of the Lord then makes a second return in verses 8 to 25. And we see that Manoah prays. By the way, I don't think I'm wrong in this. At least the word pray, this is the only time it appears in Judges. Now, Samson prays at the end of his life. But the word that I could find in my study only appears here. And what they do is they ask the angel of the Lord, how are we going to raise this kid? Okay? And they want to know how to rear him. That's verse 8. Again, I'm skipping. His way of life, verse 12. His vocation, also in verse 12. And so initially, they want to be good, godly parents. But it's debatable how good they accomplish it, how well they accomplish that. So, for example, I'm just going to have to do a little bit of skipping here. Well, they name him Samson in verse 24. The woman bore a son and called his name Samson, and the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him. Now, Samson, from my study, I'm not a Hebrew expert, my resources, it's a name that possibly can mean like the son, or little son, or even sonny boy. And most scholars believe that Samson is likely given in honor of a Canaanite god. So they want to be good parents, and yet they choose a name that would actually take us away from the God who has called him and set him apart. Others see it as connected to a nearby town called Beth Shemesh, but nevertheless, there you go. So you get these great expectations, right? So when Abraham and Sarah were barren, they were blessed with Isaac. When they were barren, they were blessed with Jacob. And when Hannah and her husband are barren, they're blessed with Samuel, and so on and so forth. And so here's Manoah and his wife, and they get Samson. So we're expecting great things. However, what it is we get in Samson is the opposites. So what I want to do today and Sunday evening is I want to highlight Samson's weaknesses, and so this will be more practical. Chapter 14, verse 1 to 4, we see he struggles from that's supposed to say entitlement, not entertainment. Entitlements. So as we come to chapter 14, it isn't long. We skip from his birth to his adulthood. That he's grown and he is turning away from the Lord. So the privilege of the Lord's anointing is used for his advantage and not Israel's. So verse 1, notice, Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. You see the entitlement, right? Now, back then, you didn't date, right? Dating is actually, within the last 125 years, something like that. Dating had a very different meaning back in the day, 19th century. But nevertheless, you didn't date back then. Families negotiated the marriage, basically. That's a bad way of putting it. But that's essentially, and so he's telling his parents, go and see to it that I marry her. The assumption is he goes into Timnah, the Philistine city, and he is looking at women and settles on one of them. And so there's nothing godly here in this at all. And so we could say that Samson falls in love. It's but Daddy, I love her, right? You know, and so he demands that his parents arrange the marriage. Now, they know this is a terrible idea. For one, it violates the law, right? You are not to do this. But remember, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And he's described as him seeing these women, and he sees one in particular he has to have. He feels entitled to it. In fact, verse 3, she is right in my eyes. That is Eden language. This is the language of Judges. So it isn't. So throughout Judges, everyone else did what was right in their own eyes, but the judges were above that. Gideon was willing to live by faith, even when it didn't make sense. Ehud was willing to be led by the Spirit to slay the Moabite king, and so on and so forth. But Samson embodies the libertarian spirit of what is right in his eyes must therefore be good. It's his truth, we could say. And if you don't buy into his truth, you're a terrible human being. We will dox you. However, the parents, though they don't like the idea, they give in. However, the foolishest of man cannot thwart the providence of God. Notice verse 4. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Now, the fact that God used Samson's blindness and weakness for his own purpose is not an excuse for Samson's sins and weaknesses. What it does show is that when God sets out to do something, it will happen despite our weaknesses. And that's good news. Because let's be honest, the American church is not in good health. And it is encouraging me to say that though that is not the way it should be, and that is not the way we want it to be, that does not mean God is stuck. God can do anything. And he could even use Samson and his entitlement. So Samson is a man who is moved by his passions, and as we see here, and then later in chapter 16, his lusts. He wants what he wants, and will run over anyone that stands in his way. I mean, Samson is your stereotypical 21st century American. His motivation for marrying this unnamed woman, she remains unnamed throughout the story, we could probably assume has nothing to do with her character, right? He has a motivation that isn't good. He ignores wisdom. He ignores authority. He ignores the will of God. And in this sense, Samson is like Augustus Gloop. You remember him from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, right? This is Samson now, right? I want it. I have to have it, right? So much so, he dives into the chocolate river, right? I went back and watched that scene. Look, that movie's weird. Can we just be honest? Like, that's not my generation that made that movie. You can make fun of our movies, but we didn't come out with Willy Wonka, right? That's on y'all, okay? That's a weird movie. They put him in the tube, and they think he's going to drown. And then, like, Willy Wonka's like, watch this. Ever see, a cannon fire, right? And he goes up. I mean, it's weird. Dark is a word for it. Yes. You go back and watch that. Just any clip. YouTube it. Just any clip. You're going to think, what did I let my kids watch, right? But Augustus Gloop is what I think of when it comes to Samson here. So he's entitled. Also think he is weak in his disobedience. And this looks at verses 5 to 9. And what you get here is, in one sense, the story is interrupted. Because we'll come back to the wedding, right? But in between there, we get the story about the lion. And here it demonstrates, and should demonstrate for us, the supernatural strength of Samson. More than that, it tells us that Samson is strong because God makes him strong. And so you'll see this language, verse 5, Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah. They came to the vineyards of Timnah. By the way, notice the vineyards there. Vineyards is where wine is made, obviously, not to insult your intelligence. So I don't think that reference is an accident. Behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. You see there, it's not just that he's been working out, but that there's a supernatural strength given to him in times when the Lord needs him and wants him to use it. And this is one of those times. So you need to remember this, because we'll see this in chapter 15, that the lion waits to ambush Samson. And it is Samson's strength that ultimately saves him. And as we'll see, it is his strength that he is given to him by God that he is to use to liberate Israel. But as so often is the case, he uses his strength for his own benefits. And so what happens is he kills the young lion and he tells no one. Now this part, I joked about the middle school boys I coach. None of those guys, I mean, within a second, they would be bragging about it to someone, you know. And so Samson doesn't do that. He doesn't really tell anyone, especially doesn't tell his parents. In fact, he slays the lion and he keeps marching towards the girl. His number one goal is to marry this girl he should not have. And so we get, days later, he returns to take her, that's the language of the text, and comes across the rotting carcass of the lion. And he sees the honey, takes it for himself, and shares it with his parents. Now, this is when he hasn't told them about the lion. So notice here, the honey, by its location, is defiled. In order to get the honey, he has to touch a rotting carcass. So the honey itself should be avoided. But he doesn't think in those terms. Here's someone who's taken the Nazirite vow, and there is a rotting carcass, and he sees something in that carcass he has to have. You see where this metaphor is going? He sees something he absolutely desires above all things. And even though the law is very clear, and he has taken a vow to avoid this, he's going to do it anyways. And not just that, but he will take the honey, and he will give it to his parents, thus defiling them. This is a major act of disobedience. When I was growing up, I thought it was just a cool story, right? But it's really emblematic of the sort of person Samson is at this point. Now, the point is that Samson was strengthened by God for his glory, but he uses it for himself. Now, what's interesting is that in the story of David and Goliath, who is a tall, strong man, Goliath, David is weak in comparison because he can't carry and wear the armor of Saul. So we have that contrast of strong and weak in the story of David and Goliath. What's interesting is that David takes on the story of Samson for himself. And in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, it says, David said to Saul, your servant, that is David, used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion and a bear, I just took that part out for length, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. This is interesting, isn't it? He's taking something out of the mouth of the lion. It's not honey, it's sheep. David uses his strength for the protection of the innocents, not for his own benefit and pride. It goes on, and if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Now that's strength. Now remember, David's not strong physically. He's a little guy. And he can't wear armor. Going out there with a slingshot. Right? But he is able to grab the lion by the beard and is able to slay it. He goes on, your servant has struck down both lions and bears. Oh my, and this uncircumcised Philistine. It's a Philistine. You're seeing the connection. They're Philistines who's supposed to be strong, but David shows that he's actually weak. All it takes is a rock to the forehead. And what does David do? He then takes Goliath's giant sword and uses it against him. He shall be like one of them, like one of those lions. This is supposed to be the story of Samson. For he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said, go get it. It's amazing parallels. Now, you'll never see this unless you've got Samson in mind, because I never saw it before. But it's incredible. David is, in this sense, a true and better Samson. Everything Samson was supposed to be, David becomes. But first, he has to become a lowly shepherd at the bottom of the totem pole of his family. But what is most significant here is not that Samson has by now violated his Nazirite vow, but that he doesn't care that he violated it. That's worse. Like, I think we can be patient with someone who made an honest mistake and has since come with remorse and repentance. I think we can work with that. But someone who does not care at all, but is rather living their truth to do what's right in their own eyes, that's a level of depravity that is hard to deal with. Well, we must move on. Next comes pride, verses 14 to 18. The old saying is that the last words of the average southern redneck is, watch this, right? Samson does something like that. His pride robs him of everything by the end of the story, end of the chapter. He loses his wealth, his reputation, his bride, and his temper. Plus, 30 men die by the end of the story as a result. So in verses 10 to 18, the battle of the lion transitions to the first battle against the Philistines. And so while preparing for his wedding, Samson is confronted with 30 Philistines to deal with him. Starting in verse 10, his father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. Again, probably a hint at wine there. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said to them, let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. By the way, that language describes very wealthy clothes. So a lot of people point out that he probably isn't just strong physically. He probably has expensive taste in clothes. That's the way, like I couldn't care less about fashion. You know that by now for 7 years. Could not care less. Clothes have one purpose, right? And it is not to impress people that you don't care about, right? I just don't get that. But Samson is very much the opposite. Another reason I don't care about fashion is I don't want to spend money on that, right? I just don't see why anyone would do that. Give me a pair of $5 shoes and I'm a happy man, right? In fact, when we first came here, I had these ugly $5 pair of Walmart shoes that were black. And there was like buy two for $10 or something. I don't know what it was. And so, Mom was really worked up because she didn't like my previous shoes. They were old and dilapidated and stuff. And she said, well, go get shoes. I got me shoes. $10. Got me 2 pairs of shoes. She said, oh, good. Now, and one was blue, one was black. She said, now, you can wear them both. Like, no, that's not how this works. I will wear the black pair because I like them better until I cannot wear them anymore. At which point they become lawn mowing shoes. And so if I can get years of use out of them, I then have a pair of blue shoes that would essentially be brand new, and then I can get essentially the equal amount of years out of them, right? It was like 2 years ago I finally stopped wearing these shoes, right? And I got like 5-6 years out of these shoes. I mean, it was awesome, That's the way it ought to go. Samson doesn't seem to be that way. He seems to really care about high fashion and how he's perceived by others. So he gives this riddle, and riddles were a common form of entertainment in ancient Near Eastern world. By the way, really until modern entertainment, riddles were common. That's one of the reasons why in The Hobbit by J.R. Tolkien, one of the greatest scenes is the riddle scene between Smeagol and Bilbo. That's a great scene, and you should really read the riddles, because what Tolkien is doing through those is just fascinating. And of course, Bilbo wins when the last riddle is, what do I have in my pocket? But Bilbo doesn't mean to ask the question. He's mumbling to himself, and that's how he escapes that and puts the ring on. You don't care about that. But riddles describe traditional riddles, the way we think of them, but also difficult questions. In fact, the word riddle here is used later in 1 Kings with the queen coming to Solomon. When Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with riddles, hard questions. It's the same word here. All right. And so solving this riddle was a type of wager. And the riddle is put there in verse 14. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. And they, of course, have no idea, because he hasn't told anyone about the lion. And so they have no idea what it is that he is talking about. And so, if they solve it, he owes them all the clothes. If they don't solve it, they owe him. High fashion, Well, after days, they don't want to lose this road and they can't figure it out. So here's Samson, possibly a bit intoxicated. He is just enjoying this. He is the life of the party, and he is giving them a riddle that they can't solve. See how wise he is? By the way, the idea of giving a riddle, it brings with it a sort of wisdom and discernment that we want from our governors, our judges, right? But again, he uses that gift for his own benefits, not for the good of Israel. So Solomon comes and he exercises wisdom. Here, this is more folly under the illusion of wisdom. And so what they do is they come to his bride and they threaten her and her family. If you don't extract from him the answer to the riddle, we're gonna kill you all. And so what she does is that she emotionally manipulates Samson to get the answer. Notice the language, verse 15. On the fourth day, they said to Samson's wife, now, they're not married, but they are. But anyways, entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? Now, so what you'll see is she will go day in and day out and emotionally manipulate him to get the answer. We're running out of time, but I'm really tempted to sort of hang out on that issue, because I think Samson is a great warning for men, but there are certain scenes in the story that I think, ladies, you need to read the story because you're right there as well. Because I think all of these things we'll look at with Samson describe essentially every man. Pride, disobedience, entitlement. We'll later see greed and lust and all that. I mean, it's just men. And when I counsel young men, they say, why am I struggling with this or that? And I'll say, I'll give you the answer. You know that Y chromosome in your genetics? That's why. You're a dude, and it's not going to go away. And Samson really illustrates for us these common areas of weaknesses for men. But here notice that when she emotionally manipulates Samson, he cannot win. The man who can slay a lion with his bare hands is not strong enough to deal with emotional manipulation of a woman he loves. Like, don't miss that significance. When men are manipulated by their wives in particular, that is a lose-lose situation. If you fight back, because I'm the man of the house, you're a bully. If you surrender, now you feel weak. And this is all so please, the story of Samson is very practical for all of us. This is a pattern you see in a lot of marriages and a lot of relationships. And she does this, and she knows this because all he wants is her. And she weaponizes that desire for her benefit, which is exactly what Samson's been doing with his strength. He weaponizes it for his benefit. And you wonder why everyone in the story is miserable. There is no genuine love, a selfless, sacrificial love for the good of others. It's use other people for yourself. And so he gives the answer, and and he knows exactly what's happening here. Notice how he responds. Men, I don't recommend this. Verse 18. He said to them, here's another poem, riddle, if you want to put it that way. If you had not plowed with my heifer. That's a great way to start a love poem. I hear the groom has written his own vows, right? If y'all ain't plowed with my heifer, right? I don't recommend that at all, okay? It's the only thing you're going to remember from tonight, right? Preacher called it Samson's wife a heifer. You would not have found out my riddle. Now, what he is saying is, you turned my fiancée, my bride, against me. You plowed with my heifer. that's not a compliment to either his bride or to the men in the room. I mean, so you can see that now how easily it is to wound an arrogant man. See how fragile masculinity can be? Look, I think most wives figure this out after a few years of marriages, that men like to give the front they are strong, like to give the front they're mighty and they can solve any problem. But if you just scratch the surface of the average man, there are a lot of insecurities they hide. A lot of insecurities they hide. So I like to remind couples that men, your wife needs affection. Ladies, your husband needs affirmation. Now, the way we receive affection or affirmation is unique to us, and it can come a variety of ways. The love language is one of those ways that Gary Chapman has tried to demonstrate how affection and affirmation is shown. But women don't need the affirmation, they need the affection. That's how they are affirmed. Men don't like affection. Usually, that's not how they are affirmed. It usually comes in other ways, right? Respect and honor and host of other things. Well, let's close out with anger, right? So now he's been wounded, and the mark of a real man is how he responds to being wounded like this. His pride isn't being stroked; it has been destroyed. How does he respond? Well, he responds with anger. Now, this story of anger turns into malice in chapter 15, which we'll look at Sunday night. But this is a good example of how just deeply depraved he is. How typical this is of men. Every man, I'm convinced, has a temper. I certainly have a temper, right? Here we see it with Samson. Verse 19, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. He went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town, took their spoil, and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So he travels 23 miles away and kills 30 men out of anger. Hot anger, it says. Rage. And his bride is then given to his best man. Now, what romantic comedy is that from, right? I mean, this is a daytime talk show worthy sort of material. Right? This has gone off the rails. Now, killing these 3 men was an act of anger and revenge. But verse 19 told us that he was moved by God. And this is the beauty of Samson's story. It'll climax at the end of chapter 16. God is still able to use a carnal heart for his purpose and glory. That's good news, not just for someone like Samson, but for you and me. God can only use carnal hearts for his good and glory, because that's all that we have. It's all that we have. And this is the beginning of the story of how God is going to deliver his people. He uses a man who is as deeply depraved as everyone else. So there is grace here. But what we see on the surface is the sort of man Samson is. And the sort of man that he is, the sort of man most men are. The sort of traps Samson gets himself in, the sort of traps most men find themselves in. The sort of weaknesses that Samson has, the sort of weaknesses most men have. But here's the thing. Samson is at his best when the Spirit of God is at work in his life. So too, the story of any man, if he is to be strong, it'll come when the Spirit of God rushes upon him. That's the secret. And Lord willing, Sunday evening, we'll see that it's just downhill from here. And you thought we were already at the bottom. It is just beginning. It will get worse. But you got to hold out to the end, and we'll see that. We'll make a beeline to the cross then. Anything you guys see in your reading and whatnot? It's a